Hello, today we're going to continue talking about domain and range. Domain and range part 2. Alright, so we know domain and range, right? Domain we know is our x values. So we put a squiggly bracket and an x, and then if I have a graph with points, I have to list my points of my x values. So my x values I know are on my left and right axis, my horizontal axis. I'll highlight it here in yellow or lime green, whatever color this is. Right? That's my x, right? So I'm going to be looking I want to go from least to greatest. So I'm going to look from my left and go towards my right because my smaller numbers are towards my left. So I go on my left and I keep going until I see a point. Boom, I see a point right here, right? What is that x value? That x value is -4. So that would be my first part of my domain. All right, then I'm going to keep going until I see another point. I see another point. Boom, right there. What is that x value? That x value is at 1. So my next domain will be 1. And then I'm going to keep going until I see another point. I see another point right here. Boom. What's that x value? That x value is 3. All right, and then I'm going to keep going until I can see another point. Boom, I see another point there. What's that x value? That x value is at 5. So my domain of this graph is -4, 1, 3, 5. For range, I can do the same thing, but range I know is my y value. So I put my squiggly bracket, put my y, so I know I'm looking for y. And I know y is my vertical axis, my axis that is up and down, right? This is my y axis I'm highlighting here in this beautiful sky blue. All right, so to find my range or my y values, I'm going to have to do something very similar. But I'm going to go from least to greatest again. So where are my smaller values? My smaller values are down, right? Those are negatives. So I'm going to start down there, and I'm going to go from down all the way up, and I'm going to stop at each point that I see and write the y value. So if I start down here, I go up until I see a point. I see a point right here. What is that y value? Well, if I go over, I see that it's at -3. So my first part of my range is -3. Then I'm going to keep going up my line, and then I see another point right here. And what is that at? Well, that's at my y value of 1. So my next part of my range is 1. I'm going to keep going up till I see another point. Boop, I see another point here. And what is the y value for that point? Well, it's at 2. And then I'm going to keep going up until I see another point. Boop, I see a point there. What is the y value? Well, it's that 4. So my range, my y values for this graph are -3, 1, 2, and 4. All right, so in algebra, when you have points on a line, or points on a graph, I mean, so you have points here, right? What you do is you list those points for your domain and range if they ask for it. Domain is your x value, so you just list the x value for each point. Range is your y value, so you put the y value for each point. And you always put them from least to greatest. But what if we have a graph that looks like this? Let me zoom in so it's a little bit easier to see. What if I have a graph that looks like this? This is not points, right? This is a line. It kind of looks like a check mark, like a backwards check mark, right? So I don't have points here, I have a line. So I can't just put points. Well, I can kind of see there's a point here, and a point here, and a point here, right? But I can't just put those points because on this line represents that there's literally points all throughout here. There's points going all through here. There's infinite points. Because for like an x value, for example, I could have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. It's impossible to list all the points on that line. So what do we do for that? Well, domain, I know, is my x value. So I put my squiggly bracket. I put an x to show that I know what domain is. Domain is my x values, and that helps me look for my x values. So instead of putting all these points, because it's a line, and there's thousands and millions and infinite points, what I have to do is I have to write it as an inequality. So I'm going to look, what is my smallest x value that this line could be? So I know my x value, again, is this one that's left and right line here, right? The horizontal line is my x. So I have to look from left to right, because left is my smallest, and we'll see what my smallest x value is. The smallest it can be is right here at -4. So the smallest my x value could be would be -4, right? And I know that my x has to be bigger than or equal to that -4. So remember that inequality sign. Remember when you first learned about those, they taught you like there's an alligator. It wants to eat the bigger thing, right? So the x has to be bigger than this -4. But if there's a dot there, so it could also be -4, but it has to be -4 or larger. So now I want to say, where does this line stop? What's my biggest x value? Well, I'm going to keep going over. Where's my biggest x? Boop. It stops there. So what is my x value there? My x value there is 3. So I run it right at 3. And x has to be smaller than or less than or equal to 3. And that is my domain of this line. That's how you find the domain of a line. You can't write all of those points because it's infinite points. It's a line. So you have to say, all right, the smallest it can be is 4. The biggest it can be is 3. So x is right here in the middle, right? So x is in between -4 and 3. It can be any point between -4 and 3. So that's why we have to write it as an inequality. All right, what about my range? How would I do my range in this situation? Well, it's the same type of thing. I have to make an inequality, but now I know my range is my y values. And my y values, I'll put it in this sky blue here again. Remember, my y-axis is this vertical axis, this up and down axis. So I have to look from smallest to biggest, see what my smallest y value is. So I see this line here, and I see it stops, boom, right there, and then it goes back up. So my smallest y value is down here. It's at -3. So -3 is the smallest it can be, and my y has to be bigger than that. So remember, I have the opening of the inequality pointing towards the y, because the alligator wants to eat the bigger thing, right? All right, so now I'm going to say, what's the biggest my y can be? So I'm going to look, see what's the top part of my line, and I see the top of my line goes to there, right? So what's my y value there? Well, it's 3. So y would have to be smaller than, or less than, or equal to 3. So what this means is my y values for this line can be any number between -3 and 3. All right, let's try another one. All right, domain, I know is my x value, right? So I'm going to put x, my squiggly bracket, in x. All right, and then I'm going to look on my x-axis, or my horizontal axis, and try and figure out what my domain values are. So I see it's a line, so I'm not going to just put the points. I have to put what the smallest number it can be and the biggest number it can be. So what's the smallest number my x can be? Well, if I start on my left, because that's where my smallest numbers are, I can see it stops right here, starts right there. And that is on -4 of my x. So it's going to be -4. And I'm going to make my inequality and put an x. And remember, the alligator's towards the x because he wants to eat the bigger thing. So x is bigger than or equal to -4. All right, so what's the biggest my x can be? So I'm going to keep going and see what my biggest one it could be. Well, the line stops here. So what's the biggest my x can be? Well, it's right there at 4. So x has to be less than or equal to 4. So my domain of this graph is any number between -4 and 4. All right, what about my range? Well, I know my range is my y values, right? And I know that my y values are my vertical axis, my up and down axis, right? And I want to go from least to greatest, and it's a line here. So I got to figure out what's the smallest y value. So my smallest y value, or the lowest my graph goes, is right here. And what y value is that? Well, that's at -3. So I'm going to put -3 and then put my inequality and put y. Y is going to be bigger than or equal to -3. Now I got to find the most it can be. So I'm going to follow my graph. What's the highest point it goes to? Well, it goes all the way up to here, and then it goes right back down again, right? So that's the tallest my graph will go. Well, what is that at my y? Well, that's at 2. So I know I have to put a 2 there. So y would have to be less than or equal to 2. And that is my range. My range for this graph could be any number between -3 and 2. All right, I got another one here we can do. Here's my domains asking for, so I'm going to put an X in my squiggly bracket so I know what I'm looking for. And I know that X is my horizontal axis, right? And I want to go from least to greatest, so I'm going to start from the left and go to the right and write down my points. This is just points, so I write points and not inequality signs. Inequality signs are only done for lines. These are points, so I can just write the points where I see. So first, I'm going to start on the left. I see my first point right there. What is that X value? It's at -4. All right, what's my next point? Boom, right here. What's my X value for that? Well, that's -3. All right, and I'm going to keep going. Boom, I see a point there. What's my X value for that? Well, that would be 0. I'm going to keep going. I see a point here. Boom, what's my X value for that? Well, it's right on top of that 3, so it has to be a 3. And then I'm going to keep going. Boom, I see one there. Well, that's at 5 on my X, right? So my 5 would be my biggest domain. So when there's points, you literally just list all the points for your X, for your domain. All right, what about range? Well, I know range is my Y values, so I put my squiggly bracket, I put my Y, and I know my Y values are going to be in my Y axis, which is my up and down axis, my vertical axis, right? And I still want to go from least to greatest, so I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up, because bottom is negative numbers, so those are smaller. All right, so I'm going to start down here and go up until I see a point. I see a point here. What is that on my Y? Well, that is at -4. All right, and then I'm going to keep going up. Boom, I see a point here. That is at -3 on my Y. I'm going to keep going up till I see another point. I see a point here. Well, what's that on my Y? Well, that's at 0. And I'm going to keep going up till I see another point. Boom, it's right there. Well, it's literally right on top of the 2, so that would have to be 2. And I'm going to keep going up, and I see another point there. And that is at 4. So my range for this graph is -4, -3, 0, 2, 4. All right, so when you have points on a graph, you list the points. When you have lines on a graph, you use inequalities to show the range, or how big or small the range and domain can be. All right, let's look at this example. This example, they gave me an equation, and they gave me, it says, evaluate the function given the domain of -8, -1, 2. Well, I know the domain is x, so that means I'm going to be solving for y. So since I'm solving for y, and I know what x is, I can substitute that x with my domain numbers. So my first domain number here is -8, so I can plug that into my equation. So then I would do order of operations to find out what y is. 4 times -8 is -32. -32 plus 7 would be -25. So that's my first x domain. So now I have to do my next one, -1. 4 times -1 plus 7. Well, 4 times -1 is -4. -4 plus 7 is 3. And then I have one more domain, that 2, so I can plug that in. 4 times 2 plus 7. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 plus 7 is 15. So my range equals my y values, which I just solved for, which are -25, 3, and 15. And that would be my answer. Remember, your range is from least to greatest. So you want to solve all of them first, and then put them from least to greatest. All right, well, what if they give me the range first? Well, I know the range is y, so that means I'm looking for my x values. So now I can plug in my y values into my equation and solve for x. So I'll do one example. So I'll plug in -1, and I got to solve for x. So now it's like an equation. So I have to get that x by itself, so I have to do the opposite to get x alone. So instead of -2, I would do +2 to get rid of that, and do the same thing on the other side. -1 plus 2 is 1. Then I have x divided by 3. I would times by 3 to get x alone, and I would have 3 equals x. I would continue on with the next two to find the rest of my domain. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. See you in class.